She called me a burden, not to my face. That would have required a kind of courage she didn't have. She said it to her mother, loud enough for the whole sunroom to hear, while I was standing, not 6 feet away, pretending to look at the bird feeder outside. He's going to be a burden on us for the rest of our lives, Mom. You know that, right? I kept my eyes on that bird feeder. A chickadee landed on the edge. Little thing, black cap, didn't seem bothered by anything at all. I envied it. That was Thanksgiving. My son Douglas's house, out in Oakville. I had driven the 2 hours from Sudbury in the rain because Douglas asked me to come. Said it would mean a lot to him. Said his wife wanted to get to know me better. I brought a 14-year-old bottle of rye whiskey I'd been saving since my wife passed, 2 jars of wild blueberry preserves I made myself from berries I picked up near Killarney, and a card with a check inside for the new baby they were expecting in March. Vivian, that's my daughter-in-law. She unwrapped the whiskey, smiled the way people smile at things they find mildly embarrassing, and set it on the counter behind the bread box where it couldn't be seen from the living room. I noticed. I notice most things. It's what you do when you've spent 34 years working your way up from a one-truck outfit to one of the largest private commercial property management firms in Northern Ontario. You learn to watch. You learn to read the room. And you learn, above all else, to keep your mouth shut until the moment is exactly right. But let me start at the beginning, because this story didn't start at Thanksgiving. It started about 8 months before that, in March, when Douglas told me he was marrying a woman I had never met. I had retired the previous year, officially at least. The company, Whitmore Property Group, still had my name on the door, but I had handed the day-to-day operations to my CFO, a sharp woman named Audrey, who had been with me for 19 years. I kept my equity stake, kept my seat on the board, still reviewed the quarterly reports every 3 months over coffee at my kitchen table in Sudbury. But to anyone looking at me from the outside, I was a retired widower in his mid-60s who drove a 2009 Ford F-150 with a cracked side mirror, wore the same 3 flannel shirts on rotation from October to April, and whose idea of a good weekend was ice fishing on Lake Ramsey with his neighbor Ray. Douglas knew I had money. What he didn't fully understand, because I had never sat him down and shown him the numbers, was how much. His mother and I had been deliberately quiet about it. We grew up with nothing, both of us. She waitressed through university, and I worked summers in the mines outside of Timmins to pay my tuition. We knew what it felt like to not have enough, and we were terrified of raising a son who didn't understand the value of hard work. So we lived modestly. We drove old trucks. We took road trips instead of flying somewhere sunny. Douglas grew up knowing we were comfortable, not knowing we were wealthy. He met Vivian at a corporate event in Toronto. She was there with her father, a man named Roland, who ran what he described as a boutique investment consultancy out of a glass office on Bay Street. From what Douglas told me over the phone, Roland was the kind of man who wore his watch on the outside of his cuff and considered that a personality. Vivian had grown up in Rosedale, attended private school, had a mother who sat on charity boards, and a father who played golf 3 times a week at a club I knew the name of, because a colleague of mine had once been quietly rejected for membership there. I should say clearly that I wanted to like her. I genuinely did. Douglas was 51 years old, twice divorced, and happier than I'd heard him sound in years. That mattered to me more than anything. We met for the first time at a dinner at Roland's house in late April. I drove down from Sudbury, arrived in the F-150, parked on the street because the driveway was occupied by a Mercedes, and what I later found out was a leased Range Rover. I rang the bell in my good sport coat, dark wool, bought in 2018, perfectly decent, and Roland opened the door, looked me up and down the way a man does when he's already made up his mind about you, and said, with that particular brand of Toronto courtesy that is somehow colder than rudeness, "You must be Douglas's father. We've heard so much." He had not heard anything, clearly. Or if he had, he'd filtered it through his own assumptions and landed somewhere that made him comfortable. Dinner was fine on the surface. Vivian's mother, Colette, asked me 3 times what I had done for work, each time forgetting my answer within minutes, which told me the answer wasn't interesting enough for her to hold on to. Vivienne herself was charming in the practiced way of people who've been taught to be charming. She asked questions, laughed at the right moments, touched Douglas's arm. I watched Roland. He talked about the market. He talked about the property deal he was working on. He mentioned, twice, in slightly different ways, the value of a property on Prince Edward County that he was evaluating. He talked the way men talk when they want you to know they are important without saying so directly. I ate my salmon and nodded and said very little. My father used to say, "Still water runs deep." I've tried to live by it. The wedding was set for September in Muskoka. Vivienne's family would handle the arrangements, Douglas told me. They had the connections up there, knew the venue, had a relationship with the caterer. I offered to contribute. Roland, through Douglas, said it was fine. They had it covered. I arrived at the venue on the Friday evening for the rehearsal dinner. I drove up from Sudbury. The venue was a lodge on a private lake, the kind of place that costs more per night than most people spend on rent. I was shown to a room, and I changed into slacks and a button-down, which is my version of formal. The rehearsal dinner was when I first heard it. Not the word itself, that came later, but the tone. The way Vivienne's cousin leaned over to her aunt and said something quiet with a glance in my direction, and they both smiled. The way Roland, when introducing me to his brother-in-law, said, "This is Douglas's father. He's from up north," with the particular inflection that turns a geography into a verdict. I smiled. I had a glass of 40 Creek, which is a fine Canadian whiskey that none of them seemed to have heard of, and I watched the lake go dark in the evening. The wedding itself was beautiful. I'll say that plainly. Vivienne looked genuinely happy. Douglas cried when she walked toward him, and seeing that made my throat tighten in a way I hadn't expected. Whatever else was true, my son loved this woman. That meant I would find a way to make peace with the rest. The trouble started at the dinner. There is a tradition at weddings. I don't know when it started or who decided it was a good idea, where guests clink their glasses to make the couple kiss. At some point during this, someone handed Vivienne the microphone. I don't think it was planned. Or maybe it was. I still don't know. She was loose from champagne, not sloppy, but loosened. The kind of loose where the filter thins. She started talking about her family, about how much they meant to her, called her father her hero, called her mother her best friend. All of that was fine. Then Douglas's name, a few sweet words about him, also fine. Then she said she wanted to introduce the room to her new family. She looked directly at me. "And this," she said, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "is my father-in-law. He drove up from Sudbury in his truck." She paused. There was laughter, small and scattered, from the Rosedale contingent. She let it sit. "We're so glad he found the place all right." More laughter. Douglas was looking at his plate. I kept my face still. I've had 30 years of boardrooms. I know how to keep my face still. But then Roland, who had been drinking since 4 in the afternoon, leaned over to the man beside him, not quietly enough, and said, "The old man doesn't even own a suit, apparently." Douglas said he had to talk him out of wearing a flannel shirt, and then, lower but not low enough, "Bit of a rough diamond, isn't he? Or just rough?" The man beside him laughed. I heard it. The woman at the table behind me heard it. I know because she shifted in her chair. I looked at my son. Douglas had heard it too. He picked up his water glass and took a long sip and said nothing. That was the moment, not Roland's words, my son's silence. I excused myself from the table, walked to the dock, and stood there for a while looking at the water. It was a clear night. You could see the Milky Way, which you can almost never see in Toronto. I thought about my wife. I thought about the drives she and I used to take up the 69 when Douglas was small, stopping at the Dairy Queen in Perry Sound, the three of us eating soft serve in the parking lot. I thought about what she would have said to me standing on that dock. She would have said, "Gerald, go back inside." And then she would have said, "But don't forget." I went back inside. I sat through the rest of the dinner. I danced once with a woman from Douglas's side who'd come up from Hamilton and who seemed as bewildered by the proceedings as I was. At the end of the night, I shook Roland's hand and told him it had been a lovely event. He patted my shoulder the way you pat an old dog. I drove back to my room. I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a long time. Now, here is the thing I need to explain about Whitmore Property Group, because it matters for what happened next. The year before the wedding, I had quietly begun acquisition conversations with a mid-sized commercial real estate fund based out of Toronto. This was not public. This was the kind of thing conducted through layers of intermediaries and holding companies, the way you do it when you don't want the market to move before you're ready. The fund managed properties across Ontario, retail anchors, mixed-use developments, industrial parks. What they needed and had needed for several years was a capital partner with a specific kind of operational knowledge. Northern markets, resource-adjacent commercial development, supply chain infrastructure. That was us. That was what we had built. The deal was finalized the following January, a significant one by any private market standard. The announcement named me as incoming chairman of the newly restructured entity, a role that gave me operational oversight of the combined portfolio. What I did not know, not until Douglas told me, awkwardly, over the phone in February, was that Roland's consultancy had been retained by that same fund, not as a major partner, as a fee-for-service advisor, the kind of arrangement where you get paid to introduce people to each other. Mid-tier work for a man who considered himself top-tier. But it was work. It was steady. And the engagement letter, I was told by Audrey, who had reviewed all the fund's contracts as part of due diligence, had a renewal clause coming up in April. The kind of renewal that needed sign-off from the new chairman. I didn't do anything with this information immediately. I want to be clear about that. It wasn't a plan. I'm not built for scheming. What I am built for is patience, and for letting things reveal themselves. What revealed itself was Thanksgiving. I arrived in Oakville on the Thursday morning with the whiskey and the blueberry preserves, and the card with the check. The house was lovely. Douglas had done well for himself in software sales. I was proud of that. Vivian's parents were already there. Roland at the kitchen island with a glass of white wine at 11 in the morning. Colette in the living room, asking the baby when it was going to arrive, directed at Vivian's abdomen. Roland shook my hand. Firm, the power grip of a man who reads those kinds of articles. "Gerald," he said. "Long drive?" "Not bad," I said. "The 400 was clear." He nodded like a man who doesn't drive the 400. We got through the afternoon. I helped with the turkey. I'm a decent cook. I've been cooking for myself since my wife died, and I've had to get competent at it. Vivian seemed surprised by this, watching me baste with the kind of expression people have when a dog does something unexpectedly articulate. Late afternoon, after the food was done and we were waiting for everything to settle, Vivian and her mother went into the sunroom. I was in the hallway, not hiding, just standing there, looking at a photograph on the wall. Douglas as a boy, 7 or 8, holding a fish up at the lake. Big grin, gap in his front teeth. That's when I heard her voice. "He's going to be a burden on us for the rest of our lives, Mom. You know that, right?" I heard Colette make a soft sound, the kind mothers make when they half agree and want to seem neutral. Douglas feels so guilty about him. He's already mentioned moving him down here at some point. To Oakville. Can you imagine? He'd be completely lost. A pause. He's just so... I don't know. He doesn't fit anywhere we go. He's a sweet man, but he's not our world, Mom. I looked at the photograph of my son with his fish. the gap in his front teeth. I had been there when he caught that fish. He'd screamed with excitement and almost dropped the rod in the water. I went back to the kitchen and I put on my coat and I told Douglas I was tired from the drive and was going to head back to the hotel. He looked surprised, then concerned, then guilty, in that order. I told him the food was wonderful. I told him I'd see him in the morning for the drive home. I drove to the Marriott on the QEW and I sat in the parking lot for a while. I called Audrey. She answered on the second ring, which is why I've kept her employed for 19 years. I told her I wanted to review Roland's consultancy contract personally before any renewal discussion. She said she'd have it on my desk, in my inbox, by Monday. I told her not to rush, no urgency. I just wanted to see it. The contract review took me about 40 minutes. The consultancy's value add on paper was the kind of thing that sounds substantial in a pitch and turns to vapor when you examine it. Introductions that could have been made through any competent network, reports that largely summarized information available through public data services. It was the kind of arrangement that had been grandfathered in over several years because no one with authority had thought to look at it carefully. I thought about it carefully. The call with Roland came the following month. It was initiated by his office. He'd been told the chairman's office was reviewing vendor relationships. He was jovial on the phone, collegial. He called me Gerald 3 times in the first 2 minutes, which is how you know someone is nervous. I told him I'd reviewed the engagement and I had some questions about deliverables. I asked him, specifically, to walk me through what the consultancy had originated in the last 18 months that couldn't have been handled through internal business development. There was a silence. It was a long silence, and it was the most honest thing Roland had ever said to me. He circled. He referenced historical context. He mentioned relationships. He used the phrase value-add ecosystem, which I wrote down because I had never heard those 3 words assembled in that order before. I thanked him for his time. I told him we'd be in touch. We did not renew the contract. I should be clear, I did not do this out of spite. I did it because it was the right business decision and because I finally had the standing to make it. Whether Roland connected it to Thanksgiving or to the rehearsal dinner, I genuinely don't know. Maybe he thought it was purely commercial. Maybe he knew exactly what it was. Either way, the outcome was the same. His firm lost a retainer that had been, according to Audrey, a not insignificant piece of their stable income. The kind of contract you build a team around. I heard from Douglas in the spring. It was a careful call. Douglas is careful when he's navigating between people he loves. He said Roland had mentioned the contract situation. He said Vivienne was upset. He asked, gently, if there was anything going on. I told him the truth. I told him the contract didn't justify renewal on its merits. That was true. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Dad, did you hear something at Thanksgiving?" I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. I said, "Douglas, I drove 2 hours in the rain to bring your wife a jar of blueberry preserves, and she put my whiskey behind the bread box. I've been patient with a lot." He was quiet for a longer moment. "She said something," he said finally. "It wasn't a question." "I'm not asking you to choose," I said. "I'm asking you to know who I am. I'm asking you to not look at your plate." He knew what I meant. He'd known since the night he didn't say anything at the wedding dinner. We talked for a long time after that. It was the best conversation we'd had in years, maybe since his mother was alive. He cried a little. Douglas cries easily, always has, always embarrassed about it, no reason to be, and so did I, which I won't pretend otherwise. He told me things about his marriage that were hard to hear. He told me Vivienne was more like her father than she understood yet. He told me he loved her, and he was also, sometimes, a little afraid of who he was becoming around her family. I told him the child was what mattered now. I told him to be the father his kid needed him to be. which meant being a man who knew his own values. I told him I wasn't going anywhere. I told him my door in Sudbury was open whenever he needed to drive north and eat something real, and remember who he was. He told me he'd been thinking about coming up for a weekend in the spring. Just him, maybe fish a bit. I said the ice should be gone by May. The baby arrived in March, 6 days late, which Douglas said was very on brand. A girl. They named her Margaret, after Vivian's aunt, not my wife, which I noted and accepted. But when Douglas called me from the hospital, I could hear it in his voice, that thing that happens to men when they become fathers, that rearrangement, that sudden recalibration of what matters and what doesn't. He sent me a photograph, her tiny face, her eyes that can't focus yet on anything but still somehow seem to see everything. I've had it as my phone wallpaper since the day it arrived. I don't know what Vivian makes of me now. I don't know if Roland has figured out the full geometry of what happened. Maybe he thinks I'm a petty old man from Sudbury who holds grudges. Maybe he's right, in part. I'm not entirely clean in this story, and I know it. But I think about something my father said to me when I was young and angry about something, some injustice at school, some kid who'd made me feel small, and my father, who worked in the mines and came home tired every night and never complained once, sat down across from me at the kitchen table and said, "Son, you don't have to prove anything to anyone, but you do have to know your own worth. Because if you don't know it, you'll spend your whole life waiting for someone else to tell you what you are." I'm 67 years old. I've been waiting for no one for a very long time. I drove back to Sudbury after the hospital visit, north on the 400, past Barrie, past the granite cuts, past the blueberry stands that were empty this time of year, the boreal pressing in on both sides of the highway like it always has and always will. I stopped in Parry Sound for a coffee. Sat in the parking lot of the same Tim Hortons that was there when Douglas was a kid, though it's been renovated twice since and barely resembles itself anymore. I thought about the chickadee on the bird feeder. Little thing. Didn't seem bothered by anything. I started the truck and drove the rest of the way home in the dark, and the heater worked fine and the road was clear, and that was more than enough. I keep coming back to that bird feeder. The chickadee that landed on the edge while Vivian's words were still hanging in the air of that sunroom. Small bird, unbothered, just going about its business. I don't think there's some grand meaning in it. I'm not that kind of man. But I do think there's something true in the image of a creature that simply knows what it is without requiring anyone else's confirmation. That's the thing about how you carry yourself over a lifetime. It either holds or it doesn't, and you find out which in moments you didn't choose. I didn't set out to teach anyone a lesson. I want to be honest about that, because the story could be told in a way that makes me sound more deliberate than I was. The truth is, I reviewed Roland's contract because it was my job to review it, and it didn't hold up. What I chose, the only thing I actively chose, was to stop pretending I hadn't heard what I'd heard, to stop absorbing other people's smallness as though it were mine to carry. There's a kind of quiet endurance that gets mistaken for weakness. I've seen it my whole working life. The man who doesn't raise his voice in the boardroom, who doesn't wear his net worth on his sleeve, who shows up in a flannel shirt and drives an old truck and doesn't feel the need to explain himself. That man gets underestimated constantly. And I'll tell you honestly, I spent years being fine with that. It kept things simple. It kept the wrong people at a distance. What I wasn't prepared for was my own son sitting at a dinner table, looking at his plate. That's the part that required something from me. Not cleverness, not strategy, just the honesty to say, plainly, that I had seen what I had seen. Douglas is a good man. He got lost for a while in someone else's idea of what success should look like, what family should look like, who his father should be. That happens. I'm not angry about it, but there is a version of love that does a person no favors. and silence in the face of someone being diminished is one of them. I had to decide whether I loved my son enough to tell him an uncomfortable truth, which is harder than it sounds when you've spent your whole life keeping the peace. What I've learned, and I mean learned the hard way, not the kind of thing you read and nod at, is that your integrity is not a separate thing from your life. It is your life. Every decision you make either builds it or chips away at it, and the accounting is slow. So slow you can miss it happening. But eventually, the balance shows up plain as day. Roland's firm lost a contract because his work didn't justify renewal. But the reason I was in a position to make that call in the first place was 34 years of decisions made with a clear conscience, one at a time, when nobody was watching. And Douglas is coming up to fish in May. He called last week to confirm. He sounded like himself. That's worth more to me than any of the rest of it. The baby's photograph is still my wallpaper. Little face, unfocused eyes, all of it still ahead of her. I hope by the time she's old enough to understand anything, she'll know that the man who drove 2 hours in the rain and brought the blueberry preserves was someone worth knowing.